Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom. And in today's video, I will be continuing to talk about the relationship between Moses and Plato. So, specifically, the Pentateuch, the Old Testament Jewish scriptures, specifically, and most importantly, the first five books, but also the wisdom tradition and the prophetic tradition and the philosopher Plato and his writings, his dialogues, as well as his legacy and the relationship between Greek thought and Hebrew revelation. So, in the first video, I kind of went over some stuff about Plato, how there's a lot of misconceptions out there. In this second video, I want to go over the Hebrew Bible, right, and its understanding of anthropology and life after death. And I want to compare the Hebrew Bible and Plato's vision, right? So before I jump into that, first of all, you need to know that I'm going to be drawing from, of course, once again, Joseph Ratzinger's book, Eschatology, Death and Eternal Life. And we'll be reading it together on the screen. But let's go ahead and summarize real quick what it is that Plato understands when it comes to anthropology and uh, life after death and his entire philosophy, really. In the last video, I wanted to make the point that, and it's Ratzinger's point, right? If Plato is understood as an individualist and a dualist who wants to get away from the biological and material world and enter into a flight into the beyond that leaves the earthly behind, right? Then Plato is fundamentally misconstrued, which is interesting because that is a very popular view of what Platonism is. Rather, we went through Ratzinger's text last week, um, actually a couple days ago, right? And we saw how Plato's project was actually to ground and make possible the political sphere and the individual's life, right? Within the political sphere. So Plato's entire project is not an individualist escape from the political, but actually his project is meant to stabilize and ground the political society that was being threatened with extinction. So, the entire intention behind Plato's philosophy is the survival of this worldly state of affairs. But how does he do that? He does it by grounding that survival in something that transcends mere biology and mere politics, right? He grounds it in this idea of the good, right? His metaphysics of being is grounded in the good, and the ethics of Plato flow out from his metaphysics, with the chief virtue being justice, and that structures the polis and ensures its survival and its stability. So you see, Plato here makes a paradoxical move that is precisely concerned with the earthly, right? He wants to secure the survival of the biological by grounding it in something more than biological and what he would say is more real. That's why the biological is a shadow compared to justice, truth, and the good itself, right? Which is real reality, the really real. But this schema is precisely what allows Plato to ensure the survival of politics and of the individual human beings in the polis. So you see, it's not some kind of, escapism. Platonism is not escapism, right? It's actually very concerned with practical affairs in this, in our world here and now, in the tangible world. Um, but it does have this lofty metaphysics, right? Now we see here how there's this schema in Plato, which is that by positing something more than biological as a really real, right? Then we make the biological able to survive and to exist, right? And for this schema to be established, Socrates is an example that when he dies for justice, he's not dying a meaningless life, he's dying a meaningful life by entering into a fuller kind of life, by entering into the good itself. So Socrates is the just philosopher who has a martyrdom that is made religious by Plato in a way that kind of grounds, you might say, the political philosophy of Plato. And so you just have this interesting, for lack of a better term, dualism, but it's a kind of it's not a radical dualism. It's not a substance dualism necessarily, but it's more of a um, a spectrum between the really real and the less real. And death for Plato, if it's done well, if you die well, right, is an entering into the really real in order and that way of seeing things is what actually makes biological, earthly, political life stable, possible, and ensures its survival. That's why Plato is not an individualist who wants to fly into the beyond and leave things behind and sees matter and the political in this world as bad. That's not at all Plato. That being said, now let's go ahead and look at what the Hebrew Bible thinks about the material, the bodily, and life after death. In other words, we saw Plato's attitude towards death and his project. What is Moses's attitude towards death and his project? Now, of course, with the Hebrew Bible, it's not just Moses, right? We have a lot more, and we have an unfolding, a historical unfolding, and we have certain steps, right? Certain enlightenments that happen just like we had in Greek thoughts, right? We started with the kind of idyllic, um, mythology of the cycle of life, right? And living and dying and having children and living in your children and being part of that cycle, right? And then you have what you see in Homer, which is this discontent with the gods and with the status quo of the world. And then you have the great figure of Odysseus who breaks free. And then Homer depicts the gods as capricious, and Odysseus breaks free and asserts himself, and this becomes a law of nature, which is the law of the individual and of power, right? The biological. It's my destiny, my self, right? Self in Greek is soma, which means body, right? And so and then you have the tragedians, right? Greek tragedy, where they insert at the end of these horrible plays where all things go wrong and the gods are making things awful and the hero is suffering. And at the end, you have the deus ex machina. Everything is made good for him. And this is a declaration of rebellion against the status quo, the deus ex machina um, narrative ploy, if that makes sense. And of course, Plato wants to ground this crisis, as we've been talking about, by grounding everything in the good through justice. And that is the really real. And that actually works. That is the Greek Enlightenment, right? That we have, Plato and Aristotle, the great philosophers. Okay, so that is on Greek philosophy. Let's go ahead and look at Ratzinger's text here to talk about the Old Testament. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so let's just dive right into it. So here we are in section 3, and it is titled The Development of the Question in Biblical Thought. So turning to the Old Testament, and we'll just read the section A today, and section B will be for another video. So Ratzinger begins. At first, Israel's concept of death simply exemplified the common views of an archaic world sheltered in the conditions of tribal awareness. Remember last week we talked about that tribal, mythological, idyllic state of human history, right? But, Ratzinger tells us, from the denial of the gods of myth and from faith in the unicity of Yahweh, there gradually came about distinct changes in the Israelite picture of reality. Those changes are debated in the crisis of the wisdom schools, a kind of Jewish parallel to the Greek Enlightenment. They were in question again in the crisis of Jewish consciousness connected with the figure of Jesus Christ, which led to the formation of Christianity. So that sentence is kind of a glimpse into what we'll be talking about later on, is what he's telling us. Continuing. In the early period, the fullness of life consisted in dying, quote, old and filled with years, end quote. What that meant was tasting the full richness of earthly life, seeing one's children and one's children's children, so as to participate through them in the future of Israel's promise. Only childish only childlessness or premature death were felt as inexplicable in natural terms. Death's malign intrusion, a punishment falling on man and shattering his proper share in life. Such events were explained by means of a connection between one's actions and one's destiny. That is, they were considered to be results of sin. So here too, life and the idea of life's essential justice remained in principle intact. So this is what, and this is me talking here, taking a break from the text. This is what some people sometimes call retributive justice, right? So there's this retributive tradition in the wisdom literature. It's apparent, especially in the book of Proverbs, for example, right? Which is, if you are faithful to Torah, you will live a long life and you will prosper, wealth and children and happiness and all that. If you are unfaithful to Torah, you might die early, you might not have children through barrenness, or through sickness. You might become sick, right? And you might suffer, right, various mishaps in your life, and that would be because of your faithlessness. Okay, so that's initially a perspective that you do see a lot in the book of Proverbs, but this, as we'll see, develops. So Ratzinger continues. Part of this widespread primitive concept of death, to which Israel has not yet made any distinctive contribution of her own, is that death is not simply annihilation. The dead man goes down into Sheol, where he leads a kind of unlife among the shades. So, famously, as most of the viewers probably know, Sheol is the pit, it's the underworld, right? That one went to when they died, according to the Hebrew Bible, especially in the Pentateuch, right? So, there was not this vision that is commonly, heard of, say, in today's modern Christian circles, right, of heaven and hell and purgatory if you're Catholic. But here, right, we have Sheol in the Old Testament, specifically the Pentateuch, but it also continues, but we'll see it gets transformed. So Ratzinger continues, as a shade, he can make an appearance in the world above and is thus perceived as dreadful and dangerous. Nonetheless, he is essentially cut off from the land of the living, from dear life, banished into a non communication zone where life is destroyed precisely because relationship is impossible. So we'll continue to unpack this, but you'll start to see here that for the Jewish people, right, for the Hebrews, right, for the Hebrew tradition, um, relationship is extremely important. Why? Because the entire Old Testament, as the title itself bespeaks, is about the covenant relationship between this one people and their God. It's about the relationship that they have with their God, and therefore that relationship structures the relationships that they have with each other in their way of living. And so covenant is a key understanding in the ancient Near East as a whole, but very especially with the Hebrew people. And we'll get more into that. But continuing with the text, the full extent of Sheol's abyss of nothingness is seen from the fact that Yahweh is not there, nor is he praised there. In relation to him, too, there is a complete lack of communication in Sheol, right? So think of some of the Psalms where David says, don't let your Holy One die and go down to the pits because he won't be able to praise you. So let me live, O Lord, so that I might be able to praise you. For God is not in the pit. That's a paraphrase, but I know there's places in the Psalms where it says, God is not present in the pit and his praises are not there either. So Ratzinger continues, death is thus an unending imprisonment. It is simultaneously being and non-being, somewhat still existence and yet no longer life. So he continues, when one looks at this non-being, which is curiously, something other than complete nothingness, one cannot just accept death as an event of the natural order. From this realization, and above all in her life of prayer, Israel developed a phenomenology of sickness and death, wherein these things were interpreted as spiritual phenomena. Okay, so I'm going to explain that sentence. In other words, we have this pit that you go into when you die. It's a kind of, um, non-existence. So it's a continued existence, but it's a non-life. So it's a mixture of being and non-being. You might say it's a world of shades, right? And but this kind of view of death um, cannot just be accepted. It can't be the end, right? And so Israel is going to develop its understanding of death and therefore of life through what Ratzinger here calls a phenomenology of sickness and death. And I'm going to read Ratzinger's text, and he's going to unpack what that sentence means, and this will become clear. So he continues. In this way, Israel discovered their deepest spiritual ground and content, wrestled with Yahweh as to their import, and so brought human suffering before God and with God to a new pitch of intensity. So this paragraph right here is basically like a thesis statement, right? Excuse me. So if you don't fully understand this paragraph, don't worry, because what this is here is him laying out his cards. He's saying this is where I'm headed, right? There's this issue with death, the way they understand it initially, and then there's it causes some kind of existential question, and then the tradition of the Hebrew tradition develops in a way that seeks to answer this question, right? An answer which Ratzinger will give us, and this enlightenment, he'll call it, this development of this phenomenology of sickness and death, right, is in fact very profound. And it reaches a new pitch of intensity, as he explains here at the end of the paragraph. So let's go ahead and open that up. What is this pitch of intensity? What is this phenomenology of sickness and death? Okay, here we go. Ratzinger writes, sickness is described with the epithets that belong to death. Okay, epithet is an adjective, right? It's a qualifier, it's a descriptor. It pushes man into a realm of non communication, apparently destroying the relationships that make life what it is, right? Life is what it is because of our relationships. In fact, we all know of um, the study. I don't know if I've ever come across the actual particular study, but I know it's true that if you feed a child, right, a newborn child, right, but do not provide him with affection and affirmation, usually through the mother, right, then even though that child might be biologically surviving, it will still die because it requires relationship in order to survive. And so there is this relationship, pun intended, between relationship and life, right? And so Ratzinger here says sickness is described with the adjectives that belong to death. It pushes man into a realm of non communication. Sickness does. Think of the leper, right? In the laws of Leviticus. The leper is cast out because of his sickness. Okay, it pushes man into a realm of non communication, apparently destroying the relationships that make life what it is. For the sick person, the social fabric falls apart just as much as the inner structure of the body. The invalid is excluded from the circle of his friends and from the community of those who worship God. I think of all the laws of the Pentateuch about this topic. He labors in the clutches of death, cut off from the land of the living. So, sickness belongs in death's sphere, right? This cutting off of relationship. Or better, death is conceived as a sphere whose circumference reaches deep into human living. Especially, this sphere is dereliction, isolation, loneliness, and thus abandonment to nothingness. Right? So we start to see here what he means by this phenomenology of sickness and death, right? This experience, this encounter with these existential, experiences, right? The key word here is experience. Okay, so he continues. The phenomenology of sickness does not only generate a phenomenology of death, and an elucidation of death's spiritual content. It also comprises a phenomenology of life. Not every mode of existence is necessarily what we can call really living. Some life is definitely non life. So here, we're going to keep reading, but I strongly recommend Pope Benedict XVI's encyclical Spe Salvi. It's his second encyclical. It is just an incredible text. So if ever you have the time, make sure you spend some time away from the internet for a bit, and go ahead and read through that encyclical. It's really beautiful, really theologically profound, and hopeful. Right? It's Spe Salvi. Right? Um, we are saved by hope, is the Latin. Okay, or saved in hope. It's from Paul. Okay, he continues to extend it. He's talking about life here would not be immortality, but rather the eternalizing of a torture, a contradiction. What is he saying here? Let me read both of these sentences so that they become more clear. It also comprises a phenomenology of life. Not every mode of existence is necessarily what we can call really living. Some life is definitely non life. To extend it would be not immortality, but rather the eternalizing of a torture, a contradiction, right? We all know that our lives are not always awesome, right? Life sometimes is difficult. And so to extend a difficult life would be torture. In fact, it sounds more like hell, right? But, because not all life is really living and some of it is non life, we see here how there's an overlap between life and death, right? Within life itself. And so real life is ultimate relationship. And that's where Yahweh is going to step in. But I'm getting ahead of Ratzinger here. Okay. He continues human life does not become real living simply by its mere presence. Genuine living is something we continually touch, yet in touching it, experience how distant we still are from it. Right? Think of those moments in your life like that are, definitional, right? Moments that make you who you are, moments where you experience meaning, love, relationship, right? This ultimate experience of meaning really is what we call blessedness, right? Life itself, the blessed life, right? So here he says, life in the authentic sense of that word is present where sickness, loneliness, and isolation are not, and where richness of fulfillment, love, communion, contact with God actually are. Life is identical with blessing, death with a curse. What's brilliant here is that not only is this philosophically very well presented by Ratzinger, but it's profoundly biblical, right? It's suffused utterly with the spirit of the Old Testament, the Hebrew spirit. None of this is contrived. None of this is made up. None of this is ad hoc. This is profoundly Jewish. In fact, Ratzinger really appreciated and admired and made use of the writings of the Jewish scholar Martin Buber, especially in his philosophy of the I thou. In fact, I would go as far as to argue that um, this whole move in the modern era towards phenomenology experience, right, and the interpersonal, although when it's cut off from sound metaphysics can become subjectivist and problematic in profound ways, is in fact a heritage from the Jewish people, from the Hebrew people, and in Christ finds a heightened pitch that is staggering, and in fact, it reaches a synthesis also precisely with the connection of Greek thoughts that we see, for example, in the Gospel of John. Now, here's a quick um, foretaste of my third video. If I do this in order, I'm going to be talking about the Regensburg lecture by Ratzinger. I just reread it yesterday, and oh my goodness, right? I think the first time I read that was 5 years ago, and I hadn't read it since. And of course, I've read a lot of Ratzinger since, and then I reread the Regensburg lecture yesterday, and it was incredible. So I'm going to be doing a video just on that. Okay, let's continue with Ratzinger here. So here I have this underlined quote here. Life means communion, whereas the heart of death is the absence of relationship. So to finish off this paragraph, the purely physical facts of existing or perishing form only the background of that distinctive human, social, and, in the last resort, theological phenomenon, which is the life of a man in its heights and depths. Isn't that a beautiful phrase? Man, this is good theology. Okay, let's continue. Because of this, the question was simply bound to arise eventually as to whether this state of affairs does not point in two directions. If, on the one hand, the physically still living and breathing human being can be dead in a state of non communication, must it not also be true that the power of communion, of divine communion at any rate, is something stronger than physical dying? May there not be life beyond physical perishing? So we see the seeds of the resurrection here. And I use that expression intentionally because Paul speaks of the resurrection as the blossoming of the seed. And we have Jesus himself in Luke chapter 12 speak of the death of the seed of wheat and the necessity of its death in order to bear fruit. And what is fruit? Right? Think of children, the fruit of the womb of women, right? And of the union between man and woman, right? Fruit here is life, right? So much going on here. You can see like Ratzinger's on a different plane here. Okay, so continuing with his text here. Yahwistic faith, therefore, makes its own potent contribution to belief in that life which is eternal, since God's, I think, let me reread that. I think I'm emphasizing it wrong. Just a second. Okay. Yahwistic faith, therefore, makes its own potent contribution to belief in that life which is eternal, since God's power is its support and stay. In the light of these connections, it becomes apparent that the acceptance of faith in a resurrection was no mere alien intrusion in Israel. So he's confirming, kind of what we've been talking about. On the contrary, Israel's archaic understanding of Sheol is what, if anything, would link her to the nations. That understanding simply illustrates a stage of awareness found in all cultures at a certain point in their development. As yet, Israel's faith in Yahweh had not unfolded in all its inner consistency. For the notion that death is a barrier limiting the God of Israel to his own finite sphere manifestly contradicts the all encompassing claims of Yahwistic faith, right? So remember, we said God is not in Sheol, right? God is not praised in Sheol. Why? Because Sheol is the realm of death, right? And God is relationship, right? And Israel is in relationship with Yahweh. And that's where he's praised. That's where God is present in that relationship. God is present to Israel, right? As a bridegroom or as a father. But in Sheol, God is not present because it's the absence of relationship. But wait a minute, that's kind of contradictory, as Ratzinger, affirms. And it's contradictory in the sense where if God is all powerful, and he'll explain how that works out, right? But if Yahweh is the Yahweh of Israel, then death can't keep Yahweh back. Death itself can be, in a certain sense, swallowed up by life, to use a phrase from Hans von Balthasar. So we can see here the unfolding of the Hebrew, way of thinking. Yeah. So let's continue. There is an inner contradiction in the affirmation that he who is life itself encounters a limitation on his power. That's basically what I just said, right? Okay. The state of affairs which such an affirmation betrays was inherently unstoppable. Oh, sorry. Let me reread that sentence. Rewind. The state of affairs which such an affirmation betrays was inherently unstable. In the end, the alternatives were either to abandon faith in Yahweh altogether or to admit the unlimited scope of his power and so, in principle, the definitive character of the communion with man he had inaugurated. So here we begin to see in seed form again the developments of an understanding of the immortality of man because he is a dialogue partner of Yahweh. Okay, let's continue. This thesis that the indestructibility of communion with God and therewith our eternal life follows in strictly theological terms from Israel's concept of God is, of course, open to no little objection at the historical level. So he says, okay, some people are going to be objecting to this, so he's going to go deeper. He's going to explain more, right? A number of Old Testament texts show clearly how popular piety in Israel lovingly sought communication with the dead in just the way found in the pagan religions of the ancient Near East. Okay, so now he's getting into his argument. So, okay, in the ancient Near East, there was this communication with the dead. And how do we know that Israel, that the Hebrew tradition had that? Well, precisely in its forbidding, as we see, for example, in the book of Kings, right? In the book of Samuel, First and Second Samuel. But Israel has to militate against that. But why? Okay, we'll see why. He continues. People were familiar with the belief in the afterlife characteristic of Israel's neighbors, and what is more, they cultivated it. The official religion of Israel, as expressed in the law, the prophets, and the historical books of the Hebrew Bible, right, First, Second Samuel, First, Second Kings, did not accept these beliefs and practices. It no more denied all existence to Sheol than, at first, it denied the existence of other gods than Yahweh. But it chose not to deal with this area. So let me reread that, right? So it no more denied all existence to Sheol than, at first, it denied the existence of other gods than Yahweh. So this view of Sheol, as well as the existence of other gods, are not denied, right? However, precisely because of the nature of Yahweh, as we see in the prophetic tradition, right? What kind of God Yahweh is, think burning bush, he's going to bring that up, right? This sets into a new context both the other gods and Sheol itself. Okay, but it chose not to deal with this area. Indeed, it classified everything to do with the dead as impure, that is, as disqualifying one for a share in Yahweh's cultus, right? His worship, so the temple, the priesthood, the law, all that stuff, right? The liturgy of ancient Israel. So let me reread that sentence. Indeed, it classified everything to do with the dead as impure, that is, as disqualifying one for a share in Yahweh's cultus, since, after all, death was synonymous with non communication between the Israelite and Israel's God, right? And worship is about communicating and praying to God, offering sacrifice, right? But in this case, are we not dealing here with a specific option of Yahwistic faith, deliberately setting itself over against the religio humana et pagana, and excluding belief in immortality in any form? So here he has in mind those exegetes, oftentimes Protestants, who bring up this total death theory. This immortality of the soul is Greek and not Hebrew theory, right? So with that in mind, let's reread that sentence. In this case, are we not dealing here with a specific option of Yahwistic faith deliberately setting itself over against the religion of other pagan nations, right? And excluding belief in immortality, right? So is this vindicating those exegetes? He says a twofold answer may be given to this question. All right, let's hear his answer. In the first place, the classification of the entire sphere of death as cultically impure is a rejection of the cult of the dead in whatsoever form. Right? It's this ban, ancestor worship off the table, unlike everyone else around us. The refusal to admit the legitimacy of a cult of the ancestors, still, of course, widely practiced in that society, was the real reason for the naturalizing of death. So, this is why Sheol is this non-existent world of shades that does not end up being right a place that where people reside that you can communicate with, right? This is why necromancy is condemned in the Old Testament. This is why you don't conjure up the dead like King Saul did, right? Because um, and this is why anything that had to do with death in Leviticus is impure, and that is because they are excluding any ancestor worship. Right? They're naturalizing death. Why? Because the only source of blessing, the only source of relationship, is not our ancestors, but Yahweh, God Himself. Right? This is the distinctive Hebrew move. That Yahweh is the only source. There's an exclusivity, right? Now, what's interesting is that in popular Protestant circles, this is what is appealed to against Catholic when it comes to communion of the saints, and when it comes to intercession, when it comes to veneration, or just society with the societas, right? To have fellowship, right, with the saints. um, they say it's pagan because look, Israel condemned all that stuff, right? So, but I do want to point out, watch how it's an appeal to to a certain part of Israel's history in the Old Testament. Oftentimes, when I disagree with Protestant friends, I find that their reasoning sometimes is unfulfilled. It's caught up at a certain point in time and doesn't look at the trajectory of Israel's faith and how it leads, in my estimation as a Catholic, to Jesus Christ, right? Well, let's continue Ratzinger's text. In a wide segment of the history of religion, the ancestor cult absorbed people's religious attention to an ever greater degree, finally pushing the high god of a given tradition to the margins of consciousness, where he eked out a miserable existence as a deus ociosus, a kind of derelict god. Think of Zeus sometimes in some of these Greek stories, dethroned and useless. The ancestor cult presented an attraction which Israel was obliged to resist if her concept of God was not to be destroyed. Thus, the comprehensive, exclusive claims of Yahweh, while incorporating the idea of the indestructibility of divine communion, demanded in the first instance an absolutely uncompromising ruling out of the cultus of the dead in whatever form. A certain demythologizing of death was needful before Israel could bring out the special way in which Yahweh was himself life for the dead. Okay, let's stop right there. That sentence right there is key, okay? Because remember I brought up the Protestant Catholic debate over this stuff, right? Here's the answer here, right? A certain demythologizing of death, right? A kind of naturalizing it away. There's no resurrection, there's no apotheosis, there's no relationship with ancestors, no worship of ancestors, no cult of ancestors that brings about blessings, all of this stuff, right? Naturalized, all down to the pit. Yahweh is not there. Praising Yahweh is not possible. No communication with Yahweh, with others. That's death. It's naturalized, right? Why did they do that? So that Israel could bring out the special way in which Yahweh himself is life, but not just life. Yahweh himself is life, but precisely because he is life itself, death is not stronger than him. And therefore the dead later on in the New Testament, but we see a development even in the Old, right, can then receive the divine life, communion with God himself. And this is the basis of the communion of the saints, right? This is the basis of a reestablishment of those who have died in life itself. This is what's behind the entire mystery of the cross, which is that Jesus is life itself. I am the resurrection and the life. And what does he do? When he dies, he swallows up death as life itself and transforms it from within. And we're going to look at the sacrificial dimensions of this in just a second. But you see here how this naturalizing of death, this cutting off from the dead, could not have the last word, right? And in fact, it should not have the last word in a truly Christian understanding of God, the world, and Christianity, religion, culture, etc., right? And so this is my criticism and of course, there's more to it, right? But this is my criticism of the Protestant critique here, is that it's stuck in a certain phase of ancient Israel's development, which was needed for Israel to precisely come to the understanding that the dead are not in a non-communication zone that is forbidden to us, but now have been established in life itself. In fact, we talked about this last video, right? In the memory of God Himself, right? That memory is what gives them permanency. In fact, we're all going to be contained in the memory of God. Um, yeah. Okay. Uh, there's more to that, so I'll stop right there. Okay. Um, let's continue. I'm getting worn out. We're not going to be able to go through all of this. I don't think it's already 40 minutes. Okay. Let's continue. Let's chip away. Okay. Ratzinger says, but secondly, the classification of the entire sphere of death as cultically impure was not without its theological consequences, for it had the effect of highlighting the connection between death and sin. Death, being linked with a turning away from Yahweh, throws light on what such separation entails. We shall meet this motif again, as, from its humble beginnings, in the primitive logic of as you act, so shall you be, it becomes ever purer until at last it arrives at insights which point the way to Christology. Once again, this paragraph is a thesis. So earlier on, when I told you, hey, watch out, this paragraph I'm showing you is a thesis. Okay, and then we went through Ratzinger's explanation. Now we're at another paragraph that is a thesis. And now let's go through Ratzinger's explanation. Okay. By way of conclusion, this worldliness, well, let me just double check here. Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Okay. By way of conclusion, this worldliness of Old Testament faith may be ascribed on the one hand to those archaic life ways which for great tracts of its history were its own, and on the other to the special claims of the Israelites' concept of God. I was going to say conception of God, but same thing, right? So that's the conclusion of everything we said earlier, right? Basically, that yes, there's a rejection of all these other things, and however, the idea of Sheol and the idea of the idea of Sheol, right, is something that you can explain from other cultures. It's just something that was common, but there's also a particular understanding of God that Israel has that contributes to its understanding of life and death. Okay, the claims required. Let me reread that. These claims required the elimination of the cult of the dead and the ideas of immortality which that cult enshrined. And that's the thing I would ask a Protestant here. We no longer believe, as the ancient Israelites had, that death is this place where God is not present, because we believe that Jesus Christ liberated us from death. And so the ancestor cults in that time period, right, enshrined the idea of immortality. And of course, that was able to eclipse the uniqueness of Yahweh, right? So that could be a fair critique. But the thing is, because Christ came, the context is fundamentally different for the Catholic, because we understand that the life of those that have died is now Christological, right? And that Christology itself is only possible with a Jewish conception of Yahweh, right? Okay. Yet at the same time, and inevitably so, the same concept of God made it impossible for such this worldliness to have the last word. Hence the idea of resurrection. What we are confronted with is therefore an inherently unstable and open historical process. It is a misconception to regard it as a static dogmatic structure. The apparently contradictory demands of the concept of God in Israel made the long journey a taxing one. The final crisis of the traditional doctrine erupted at last in the wisdom books. Those monuments to the Israelites, let me reread that sentence, excuse me. The final crisis of the traditional doctrine erupted at last in the wisdom books, those monuments to the Israelite enlightenment. In their different ways, Qoleth and Job express and canonize the collapse of the ancient assumptions. So that's what we're going to get into next. So Qoleth is the author of the book of Ecclesiastes. Is it Ecclesiasticus? No, it's Ecclesiastes, right? All is vanity, the kind of depressing book in the Bible where, animals and us, there's nothing different. When we die, we die. We go back to the dirt, to the dust that we've been made from. And that's all there is to it. And so why not party? Why not be rich, and have many wives and many children and eat a lot, drink a lot, and party it up like all these despots from the nearing nations. This is, as you can see, this book, right? Why, first of all, why was it inserted into the canon? And precisely because of this crisis in the wisdom literature tradition, right? Because it used to be, as you see in Proverbs, if you do good, if you obey Torah, you're going to be happy. You're going to be filled with blessings. And if you do bad, if you disobey Torah, you're going to be miserable. You're going to be filled with curses and mishaps and sickness and suffering and ultimately death, probably premature. And your wife will be barren and no children, etc., or your children will die. Think of Job, right? And that's the point here, is that there's this crisis, in Qoleth, right? And the author of Ecclesiastes is thinking, what the heck? I thought, right? If I obeyed Torah, everything would be fine. But look at these despots in the neighboring nations. They're not obeying Torah and they're partying it up, right? They have a lot of blessings, And so he's like, well, this is nonsense, And so there's this existential crisis. And oftentimes we see this, that crises come hand in hand with enlightenments, but also enlightenments need to be channeled. Think of what we talked about last video with Plato and the way he responds to the crises that were started by Homer and the tragedians, and kind of having a hard time there with the sophists, right? Plato steps in and fixes things, I would argue. Okay. All right. Let me just get a drink here. Okay. Let's continue. So both books, right, Qoleth and Job, both books offer a radical critique of the long established connection between action and destiny. So we talked about this, right? Proverbs is a good example. They hold that the assertion of such a connection is false. Human life and death have no manifest logic. In Qoleth, this realization precipitates a profound skepticism. Everything is nonsensical, all is vanity. These statements are but parried in a half-hearted way by the author's half-skeptical, half-believing resignation. Though he is ready to live without meaning and to trust in a meaning as yet unknown, he can hardly suppress the question whether it might be better not to have been born at all. Life enters a crisis condition. I just want to comment on how really beautiful that's. I wonder what it sounds like in the German. It's got to sound amazing in the German. Let me reread that sentence. Though he is ready to live without meaning and to trust in a meaning as yet unknown, he can hardly suppress the question whether it might be better not to have been born at all. You see, even in that sentence, there's an echo of the story of Judas, which is really interesting. Um, I don't know if it's intentional. Maybe it's the English translation, but I just love that sentence. Okay, life enters a crisis condition. Okay, Job, right? So Job gives even more dramatic expression to the internal conflict within the wisdom schools and the resultant repudiation of their classic action destiny schema. The book's climax appears to be the appeal to God as Redeemer over against the God of senseless destruction found in ordinary experience. See, what's so cool about this, man, it's awesome. What's so cool about this, right, is that he's saying these things, right? Ratzinger's writing these sentences, but you can tell he has in the back of his mind all of these other things if you know how to listen carefully, right? Let's reread that. And because I'm thinking of a passage in Introduction to Christianity where he speaks about this. So let me reread that sentence and I'll show you what's behind his mind. The book's climax appears to be the appeal to God as Redeemer over against the God of senseless destruction found in ordinary experience. So obviously, Redeemer here cues you to Jesus Christ, right? But there's more to it than that. There's a chapter 2, I think it is. There's a chapter in the book by Ignatius Press, Faith and Politics, which is a collage of Ratzingerian uh, texts, right? And in it, he talks about the Pantocrator, right? The God of the universe, which is kind of like this cosmic. Well, Pantocrator may not be actually the best way to explain it because that's more for the creed. Sorry, tangent. There's the God of the universe, right? The God who creates all things, and he's distant. He's almost seen as a cosmic force. He's not personable. You can't enter into communication with him, into relationship to covenant, right? And so death seems to be one of these cogs in the machine of cosmic fatalism, right? Like we're just all, withering away, and then death is this black hole, to use language that's scientific, right? On purpose, right? Kind of cold language. There's this black hole of death, and you get sucked into it, and that's all there is to it. And these cosmic forces don't give a crap about me. Okay. And in Job, right? Job puts his hope in the God of faith over against the God of such experience, right? And the God of faith is seen as a redeemer, right? Who is not a God of senseless destruction found in ordinary experience, but a God of faith. Now, what is faith? Faith is a response. Response to what? To an address, to a personal address, to a God who speaks, to a person who hears and thereby believes. Think of Romans 10, right? Just read the whole chapter, Romans 10, right? And that's what's in the back of his mind here, is the the event of the incarnation of the Paschal mystery bridges a gap between the kind of cosmic God of the philosophers and even of other religions to a certain extent, right? When they have their own enlightenments, and then the God of Christianity, which is made present among us in a personal way. Now, in Introduction to Christianity, there's this beautiful and wonderful and amazing passage on the burning bush that I strongly recommend. Don't remember what chapter it's in, but read Intro to Christianity. Okay, let's go ahead and continue. So Job puts his hope in the God of faith over against the God of such experience, entrusting himself to the one who is unknown. There may be a glimmer of hope here for an abiding life to come, but the textual tradition is too uncertain to allow any worthwhile judgment about the form such hopes might have taken. Okay, just a scholarly observation there. Okay. Job and Quileth then document a crisis. With their aid, we can feel the force of that mighty jolt which brought the traditional didactic and practical wisdom to its knees. Yet before this denouement, something of a breakthrough to a new level of insight had occurred in the spiritual experience of the prophets and other pious individuals in Israel, and this proved able to sustain faith in the crisis of wisdom. What is he talking about? In the first place, we have the interpretation of the painful experience of the exile in the servant songs of 2nd Isaiah. There, sickness, death, abandonment are understood as vicarious suffering, and in this way, the realm of death is filled with a novel, positive content. Remember that paragraph I told you about earlier? That's a thesis? We're unpacking it right now. All right. So, there, sickness, death, abandonment are understood as vicarious suffering, right? In the suffering servant of 2nd Isaiah. And in this way, the realm of death is filled with a novel, positive content. Interesting. It's no longer negative. What's this positive content? It's the unfolding of the understanding of God that Israel has. It's the step forward in the wisdom tradition that seeks to move beyond the kind of retributive understanding of faithfulness equals blessing and faithlessness equals curse, right? But here, rather, there can be a faithfulness within curse, born for others' life. That's so cool, right? The way he presents all this, it's yeah, it's really awesome. And so he says here, death and deprivation through illness are not simply the duly apportioned punishment for sins. They can be the proper path of someone who belongs to God. And treading that path in suffering, the servant of God can open for others the door to life as their savior. You see, the texts like these really enrich your reading of scripture because look at the way he explains this, right? The door to life. Think of John's gospel. You can see that John's gospel permeates Ratzinger's thinking, right? Jesus describes himself as the shepherd, as the door, as the life itself, resurrection, the way, the truth, all these things. The idea of the mediator, that's how I understand. I understand it in a Johannine way as meaning the door. He opens the floodgates of relationship with the divine, right? In his person, he is that door. Okay. Suffering for God's sake and that of other people can be the highest form of allowing God to be present and placing oneself at the service of life. Disease and death are no longer now that threshold beyond which a person becomes useless, a thing without meaning, right? In Sheol, there's no worshiping of God, not least for God, whom he can no longer praise. Well, I didn't expect him to say that next. Okay. These apparently wholly negative things are no longer forms of subjection to the absolute void of Sheol. So the theological content, the spiritual content of death is changing. Logically so from Israel's understanding of God. We see here the development in Israel's coming to grasps of God's addressing of Israel. God is addressing Israel, and Israel is listening. Um, and yeah, especially in the Psalms. Man, the Psalms are incredible. Okay, I need to find a stopping point here. I'm getting tired out. It's 57 minutes. Okay, let's find a stopping point. Let's continue reading here. So, these apparently wholly negative things are no longer forms of subjection to the absolute void of Sheol. Rather, are they a new possibility of not only doing, but being more than one ever could do or be through the holy war or the cultic service of the temple. So, let me reread that to make it more clear. I'm probably emphasizing it wrong. Okay, so rather, are they a new possibility? What's they? They is sickness and death, right? A new possibility of not only doing, but being more than one ever could do or be through holy war. So, death here is what he's saying is death here, and sickness and suffering might in fact do more for God and be more for the faithful Son of God, right? Than holy war, right? Um, and so we see here the beginning of the gospel of this understanding of Christianity, which, the kingdom of God is not a political norm, as Ratzinger puts it, but it's a moral norm for politics, but it's not a political norm. And so what that means is that Jesus' revolution does not look like an overthrowing of the status quo by means of the same tools as the ones oppressing us, i.e., politics, but by means of the liturgical sacrifice of love, which is divine on the cross, right? By being crucified by the instruments of tyranny, the cross or the Roman torture instruments. He undoes oppression and liberates us through the power of God and not the power of man, right? But that's a whole different conversation that we'll have to talk about some other time. So the key to this new possibility is mercy, declared as early as Samuel to be more than sacrifice. So even sacrifice here is transformed. And that is also something I want to talk about, but there's too many things here going on. Because it's, we said it's not the Roman response to overthrow Caesar by means of the instruments of Caesar, but neither is it the Jewish response, right, of the temple and of the sacrifices of the old law. It's a new sacrifice, and the new temple is his body, which is a spiritual body, as Paul says in Corinthians, soma pneumatikon, right? So you have a spiritual Christology here, which fills Ratzinger's thought through and through. But we'll talk about that some other time. I actually do have a paper on this that I want to make a video about, so we will revisit that for anyone who's watching my stuff. Okay, the reason why these insights are so important is that sickness, death, and Sheol remain phenomenologically identical. Thus, death no longer appears as the end, as irreversible falling into nothingness and doom. Rather, does it stand out as a purifying and transforming power. Sickness and death are now the way and lots of the just, where injustice becomes so profound that it turns into the mercy of vicarious service. The question, then, as to whether or not resurrection in the proper sense of that word is already spoken of in such a text as Isaiah 53 9 through 12 is really secondary. So I'm going to read Isaiah 53 9 through 12, and that's how we'll conclude. But let me end this paragraph. Resurrection is obviously implied there in Isaiah 53. Sheol does not hold the one who suffers in the way of the servant. Contrariwise, it is by his suffering that the surface of our seeming life is pierced by life in all its authentic plenitude. Such a beautiful phrase, right? It is by his, so the suffering servant, but Jesus, right? It is by his suffering that the surface of our seeming life, you see how similar to Plato this is, right? Our life of shadow, right, is pierced by life itself, the really real. And that grounds the Christian understanding of being in the world and yet not of the world. There's a spiritual, there's what Ratzinger would kind of call, I guess, a pneumatic realism, right? Okay. It is by his suffering that the surface of our seeming life is pierced by life in all its authentic plenitude. Right? Christ is pierced for our sake. And in a certain sense, he pierces us if we allow him to, and then enter into the piercedness of Christ and are able to also vicariously be a source of life in our own deaths for others, right? So we'll end with a reading of this passage in Isaiah. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Whoops, sorry about that. Okay, so verse 9 through 12 from Isaiah 53. They made his grave with the wicked, and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him with pain. When you make his life an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and shall prolong his days. Through him the will of the Lord shall prosper. Out of his anguish he shall see light. He shall find satisfaction through his knowledge. The righteous one, my servant, shall make many righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will allot him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out himself to death, and was numbered with the transgressors. Yet he bore the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. So that concludes the second video here, and I want to tie both the first and the second video together by making a third, which will be a reading through and a commenting on the Regensburg Address. Now, if you have enjoyed the first video, so for some reason the first video like got a bunch of views. Like I'm not, I'm so happy about that, but I'm wondering if there isn't another reason why, like some kind of algorithmic reason, because most of these long format videos, are kind of heady, and people usually tend to gravitate towards the more controversial stuff. So I don't know why my last video did really well. But if you're watching this and if you did appreciate my last video and you appreciated this one, please comment down below whether you want to see more of this kind of content, right? Because I'm not exactly sure what people enjoy, but also honestly, even if people didn't like this, I'd probably continue because it gives me practice in teaching, even though no one's like physically here. And it also is a log in my studies to see kind of where I'm at in my reading and my understanding of theology. So I just want to know if you guys enjoyed this. So put it in the comments down below. That being said, it would really help out if you guys liked this video. Of course, if you're watching this and you're not subscribed, It ain't gonna hurt you to subscribe. It'll definitely help me. So do that. And if you want to be ready, if you want to be notified when the next video comes out, hit the notification bell. Okay. Now, if you want me to continue my studies and to make great content and to ameliorate the tools I use to make this content, consider supporting me at patreon.com/the Logos Project. My website, of course, is theecclesiablog.com. Go there to find all my stuff. I will soon be, I don't know how soon, but I'm trying to work on finding a way to link these t-shirts, right? These Logos Project t-shirts here. And there's a huge logo on the back to the website. But all that's a work in progress. So thank you everyone for tuning in, for supporting me, for those of you who do. And we'll see you guys in the third video on the Regensburg lecture. Thank you all very much. God bless.